Did you know that the most famous villain of the 80s was actually the hero of his own story? A man whom the whole world turned into a monster before he decided to become one himself.
And the most disturbing thing of all is that if you know his whole story, you'll end up doubting who the real villain of this tale was. Stay until the end, because there's a twist no one told you about when you were a kid, and a question you'll have to answer for yourself. Germany, early 20th century. A boy is born into an ordinary family, with no fortune, no last name to open doors, a small house, a father who worked from dawn to dusk, a mother who barely had time to listen to him. Nothing in his crib hinted at what that boy was about to become. But from a very young age, something about him was different. He learned to read before the other kids on his street. At 6 years old, he was already devouring books that his own parents couldn't understand. By 8, he was solving problems that his teachers didn't know how to solve. While other kids played soccer or ran through the alleys, he would sit alone in a corner of the town library, reading books about biology, anatomy, and ancient history. He was, without exaggeration, the smartest kid in his entire class. But he was also the weakest, skinny, pale, with thick glasses that constantly slipped down his nose. He couldn't run fast, didn't know how to fight, and didn't fit in with any group. And in Germany during those years, being different wasn't a virtue, it was a condemnation. His classmates humiliated him every day, waiting for him after school, hidden behind the same tree. They threw his books into the mud while laughing out loud, making fun of his voice, the way he walked, every word that came out of his mouth. And worst of all, it wasn't the beatings. The worst part was that no one stopped them. His teachers completely ignored him. Some even laughed along with the other kids. To them, a strange kid who talked about uniting species, about forced evolution, about surpassing the limits of the body, wasn't a genius ahead of his time. He was a laughingstock in the teacher's lounge. The whole world, without ever saying it in exact words, repeated the same message to him every day. You're useless. You're not going to get anywhere. You're the weak one, and the weak don't matter. And that boy, the same one who decades later millions of people would know as the most feared villain of an entire generation, was named Hell. Every blow, every humiliation, every laugh behind his back was stored somewhere inside him, like someone storing gunpowder, silently waiting for the right spark. In the basement of his house, far from any prying eyes, little Hell began to experiment. He would get small animals, mice he caught in the barn, insects, or an injured bird he found lying in the street. He dissected them with a precision that no child his age should have. He studied every organ, every muscle, every system. He wrote everything down in notebooks that he hid under his bed. And then he started doing something that no one around him could have imagined. He tried to join those animals together. He took parts from one, parts from another. With the rudimentary tools of a small-town boy, he tried to create something stronger than the sum of its parts. He didn't do it out of cruelty. He did it because, even at that age, he already had an idea stuck in his mind that would never leave him. The individual is weak. What stands alone breaks, is humiliated, is destroyed sooner or later. But what is fused? What is combined? What manages to be more than one thing at the same time? That is the only thing capable of surviving in a world that doesn't forgive the weak. One day, his classmates followed him home. They went down to the basement without him knowing, and what they found left them stunned. That same afternoon, they spread the word throughout the whole town. And from that day on, Hell stopped being just the weakling of the class. He earned a new nickname, one that would haunt him for years: the Crazy Boy, the boy who played God with dead animals. That night, locked in his room with the laughter still echoing in his head, little Hell made a vow in a low voice, almost a whisper. One day the whole world would beg him. One day, no one would ever call him weak again. One day, everyone who laughed at him in that schoolyard would beg for his forgiveness. Years later, the First World War broke out. Entire towns watched their sons, their fathers, their brothers leave, and many of them never returned. While all of Germany mourned its dead, young Hell saw the same war with completely different eyes. For him, that massacre wasn't a senseless tragedy. It was proof, the ultimate proof that he had been right since he was a child. The most advanced civilization on the planet, with all its science, with all its culture, was destroying itself over borders drawn on a map. Out of pride, over almost nothing. If this was the best the human species could offer the world, then the human species as it was didn't deserve to survive on its own. It needed to evolve. It needed to stop being a bunch of weak individuals fighting among themselves and become a fused whole, something superior, something that could no longer destroy itself so easily.
With that idea already fixed in his mind like an obsession, he entered university as always, the youngest student of his entire class. He solved in hours what took his classmates whole weeks. His professors didn't know whether to secretly admire him or openly fear him. And exactly the same thing happened again as it had at the school he attended as a child. In private, some teachers called him the brightest student they had seen in decades. But that same admiration disappeared as soon as he stood up to present his ideas in front of others. In public, at every conference they called him a heretic. His theories about biological fusion, about forced evolution, about surpassing the natural limits of the human body, earned him a new title, the same as always. But when it came from adults, he was now the mad scientist. But this time, something different happened. In one of his most controversial seminars, one where half the faculty stood up in the middle of his presentation to boo him and leave the room. Only one student stayed seated until the end, listening with genuine attention, taking notes. A young Japanese man as brilliant as hell, but completely different in every other way, named Huso Kabuto. Kabuto didn't agree with almost anything Hell proposed that afternoon. But when the conference ended, he went up to congratulate him on the rigor of his work, something that no other classmate had ever dared to do. Weeks later, they met again in the same university biological research laboratory, assigned to the same project purely by chance. Hell worked at night, almost always alone, while the rest of the faculty slept. Kabuto found him there one early morning, surrounded by diagrams that no one else dared to draw. Instead of running away or reporting him, as any other student would have done, Kabuto sat down next to him and started asking him questions. That early morning they talked for hours about the limits of science, about how far human knowledge should go, about what price was worth paying for progress. Neither of them convinced the other of anything. But at dawn, when they finally left the laboratory, something between them had changed forever. From that moment, a strange rivalry was born. The kind of rivalry that plays out in every exam, is cited in every thesis, and unfolds in every laboratory. But that also, deep down, involves a quiet mutual respect and admiration, even though neither of them would ever admit it out loud. But from the very beginning, something deep separated them, something that no friendship would ever be able to resolve. Kabuto believed that science existed to serve humanity, to heal it, to protect it. Hell, from that childhood basement, had already decided that science existed to surpass humanity, to forcefully correct it if necessary. One wanted to save the world as it was. The other had already decided, since childhood, that the world as it was didn't deserve to be saved. The years went by. Hell finished his studies as one of the most brilliant and also most feared scientists in all of Germany. Kabuto, for his part, specialized in medicine, always faithful to the idea that science should serve humanity. Fate separated them for more than 2 decades, each one building his own path. And then the whole world began to burn again, this time more fiercely than ever. The Second World War came. Hale did not hesitate for a single second. He joined as a doctor and military scientist. His intelligence, the same that had made him the object of ridicule all his life, was suddenly exactly what an army desperate for any advantage needed. He designed weapons, he designed experimental enhancements for the bodies of wounded soldiers. He proposed techniques that no other doctor in his right mind would even dare to mention out loud. He did things that to this day science prefers not to remember in too much detail. And in the midst of all that horror, amid explosions and field hospitals packed to capacity, Hale found something he never expected to find in his life. A friend, a young soldier with an easy smile even in the worst moments, who for some reason that Hale never fully understood, didn't look at him with the same contempt that the whole world had shown him since he was a child. He treated him as an equal, asked him questions about his theories, truly listened to him, laughed with him, and not at him. Together they survived nighttime bombings, entire weeks without decent food, endless nights waiting for the next enemy attack. And for the first time in his whole life, Hale felt something like trust, something like, even though he would never have put it in those words, belonging somewhere. Until in an attack that came without any warning in the middle of the night, his friend was left shattered on the battlefield. Hale didn't think twice. He carried him himself through the crossfire to his improvised field laboratory. And there, with trembling hands, for the first time in years, he tried the unthinkable. He wanted to save him using his own experimental techniques, to fuse what was left of his shattered body with metal, with machine parts, with anything that would allow him to keep him alive. One more minute. He worked for hours without stopping, without sleeping, without eating, while the war raged outside. He failed. His friend died screaming on that improvised operating table, turned into something that was no longer completely human, but hadn't managed to become a machine either. Something half-finished, suffering, with no chance to live or die in peace. Hale had to destroy with his own hands what was left of the only person who ever treated him as an equal. That night, in silence, something inside him broke forever. He didn't cry. He had no tears left for that, or maybe he never knew how to use them. He felt something else. Much colder, much more dangerous. The absolute certainty that next time he wouldn't fail, no matter what that meant, no matter the cost. Weeks later, in a trench covered in snow, mud, and blood, he found a dying officer with wounds that no other doctor would have bothered to try to treat. Anyone else would have let him die in peace. Not Hale. His lower body was completely shattered, impossible to heal by any known method. He carried him back to his lab again, and there, kept on ice since that night he swore never to fail again, was the only thing he had left of his friend. This time he didn't hesitate to use it. With the same technique that had failed months before, now perfected by obsession and time, he joined what was left of one man with what was left of the other. And this time he didn't fail. He brought him back to life. But not as he was before the explosion that nearly killed him. He brought him back to life as something completely different. Something that, in the most literal sense, would never die again. That officer became the man who, years later, the whole world would know as the beheaded Count, a cyborg whose head lived separate from his own body, controlling it remotely. The first successful experiment of the man who, without knowing it yet, was about to become Dr. Hell. The war ended soon after, and with it, any trace of humanity that Hell still had hidden somewhere also disappeared. Years later, already recognized in certain scientific circles as a mind both brilliant and dangerous, Hell was invited to join a top-level international expedition. Destination: a mysterious island lost in the middle of the Mediterranean, Bardos Island. And the person coordinating that expedition, the one who had personally recommended him to be part of the team, was the same man he had met years earlier at that university, Yuzo Kabuto. Despite everything that separated them, despite their endless arguments about scientific ethics, Kabuto still saw Hell as the best scientist he knew. And that gesture of trust, without either of them knowing it yet, was exactly the mistake that would change the history of the entire world. The team was rounded out by doctors, engineers, and archaeologists from different parts of the world, all drawn by Kabuto's reputation and partly financed by the fortune that Hell had amassed during the war. For weeks, in meetings before the trip, Hell presented himself as the perfect colleague, disciplined, generous with his ideas, always willing to help anyone on the team. No one suspected a thing. No one could imagine what he had already been planning in silence long before boarding that ship. The ship arrived at Bardos in the middle of a storm. The local fishermen refused to go near those shores. They spoke of ancient legends, of sleeping gods, of a place that should not be touched. The scientific team, of course, ignored the warnings. They began to dig, and what that team found underground, no one, absolutely no one, was prepared to see it. Beneath layers of rock accumulated over thousands of years, there slept a civilization completely lost to the history books, the Maquin Empire. And next to its ruins, something even more impossible to explain. Hundreds of giant robots, asleep, intact, covered in ancient dust, mechanical beasts with a power that no modern scientist could even begin to understand. The team took 3 full days to clear access to the main chamber. They worked almost without sleep, taking turns with oil lamps because electricity didn't reach that deep underground. The air down there smelled of damp stone and something else. Something metallic that none of them could identify at first. When they finally broke through the last stone wall, something unlike anything else appeared. A sealed container, smooth, made of a dark metal that looked like nothing they'd ever seen. Nothing that the science of their time had ever cataloged, with a surface that moved almost like liquid under the lamplight as if it were breathing. Kabuto grabbed him by the arm. "Wait," he said. "We don't know what this is. It could be dangerous." Hell didn't wait. He had never waited for anything in his life. And he wasn't about to start now, in front of the only thing that in 43 years finally seemed to have an answer for him. He touched the surface with the palm of his hand, and the whole world disappeared. What they found that night was the complete legacy of a civilization that had reached a point humanity didn't even dare to imagine. The exact point where the biological and the metallic stopped being two different things and became one. Hell saw it all. He saw machines soaring through the sky like metal gods. He saw entire armies surrender at the mere sight of their shadow. He saw whole civilizations kneel, afraid of what those machines represented. The final evolution, the next step that no weak human would ever be able to take on their own. He saw real power, the only power that truly matters. And in that moment, something inside him broke completely. Or maybe, something that had been dormant inside him his whole life finally woke up. He saw it clearly, standing in front of those ancient machines.
This was exactly what he had been looking for since that basement in Germany.
This was the perfect fusion between the old and the modern, between the human and the mechanical, between science and something that was already bordering on the divine. With this in his hands, he didn't need to ask anyone for permission ever again. He didn't need the world to tell him he was useless ever again. Never again. That very night he gathered the entire scientific team in the center of the ruins, by the light of improvised torches. With the sleeping mechanical beasts in the background as silent witnesses, he showed them the greatest discovery in the history of humanity, and asked them, with a calmness that gave several of them goosebumps, for absolute loyalty so he could use it as he pleased. They refused. But before anyone could move from that place, Hell began to speak, and for the first time in the entire expedition, he fully revealed what he had been thinking since he was a child. He told them that he had spent his entire life surrounded by weak people, people who were afraid of anything different, people who preferred to destroy what they didn't understand. Instead of trying to understand it, he told them that all of humanity had spent the last century killing itself in war after war. Well, there, beneath their feet, lay the proof that something better existed. A civilization that had achieved the perfect fusion between the biological and the mechanical, between the individual and the collective. He told them that he did not want to destroy humanity. He wanted to save it from itself, even if he had to force it to do so. Some even felt for a second the temptation to listen to him. Hell's logic had something almost hypnotic about it, something that sounded more like an uncomfortable truth than madness. But Kabuto was the first to stand up and broke the silence. He told him in front of the whole team that what he was proposing wasn't science. It was the same delusion of domination he had carried since he was young in every thesis, in every forbidden theory. Only now, for the first time in his life, he had the real power to make it possible. He begged him to reconsider. He reminded him of everything they had built together as colleagues, as almost friends. For years, Hell listened to every word without changing the expression on his face. He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't get upset, he didn't try to convince anyone of anything else. He simply gave the order, killed the entire scientific team of the expedition, his colleagues, the very people he had lived with for whole weeks on that island, in cold blood. One by one, among the same ruins they had sworn to protect together. Only one man managed to escape alive in the midst of the chaos. Yuso Kabuto, the same man who years later would build the only robot capable of facing everything Hell was about to create, Mazinger Z. Hell was ecstatic, almost on the verge of madness. He could feel the power running through his own hands. What he didn't know, what no one in that expedition could have known, was that the very technology of the Mykenes carried with it a dark side. That very dark side was, centuries ago, what caused the fall of an entire empire. And now, that same power, that same boundless ambition, was taking complete control of him. His body was changing, not just in color. He was becoming stronger, smarter, and also more bloodthirsty with every passing hour. But there was still something else waiting for him. Among the ruins still stained with blood, Hell found something else. The mummified bodies of two ancient Mycenaean rulers, a man and a woman, with half of their bodies destroyed by the collapse of their own tomb thousands of years ago. And Hell, once again, like that boy in his childhood basement, saw the perfect opportunity before his eyes. What began with secretly dissected mice was now completed with the fusion of two emperors from a civilization the whole world believed lost forever. He worked for days on end, barely sleeping, joining the remaining halves of both bodies with Myken technology, which he was only beginning to understand. One single body, two minds trapped inside, two voices constantly fighting for control. One male, one female. When that new being finally opened its eyes, it spoke with two different voices coming from a single throat. One voice was deep, cold, and calculating. The other was higher-pitched, theatrical, almost mocking. Both halves argued with each other over every movement, every word for control of the same body. And yet, both agreed. They focused on one thing: an absolute loyalty to the man who had brought them back to life.
Baron Ashler was born, his first lieutenant, his first creation built with the lost technology of the Mycenae Empire. But hell didn't stop there.
In the following years, while secretly building his army from the depths of Bardos, he continued perfecting the same art he had practiced as a child in that basement. More cyborgs, more fusions that modern science considered impossible, more mechanical beasts brought back to life after sleeping for millennia underground. Bardos stopped being just a lost island on the map. It became his fortress, his personal army, his temple, his silent revenge against an entire world that once called him weak, without even truly knowing him. Years later, when he finally felt that his army matched his ambitions, Hell gathered his 3 main lieutenants in the central hall of his fortress, Baron Ashler, arguing with himself in 2 voices as always, the headless Count, with his head floating under his arm, martial and silent, and Viscount Pigman, the most recent of his creations, with an ancient power that even Hell himself did not fully understand.
He showed them a map of the entire world, and for the first time out loud in front of other beings, he said the name he intended to etch into history, Dr. Hell. He was no longer the weak child from that German village, no longer the heretic student who was booed at every conference, no longer the doctor who failed to save his friends.
He was, at last, exactly what he had sworn to become that night in his childhood.
The humiliated child in that schoolyard. The German no longer existed at all. In his place was a man who had decided to call himself Dr. Hell. A genius who, if the world would not give him a place willingly, was ready to take it by force, no matter the cost or who he had to destroy along the way. And from the shadows of his new fortress, Hell looked out at the rest of the world, beyond the horizon. He knew that somewhere Kabuto was still alive, hiding. He knew that sooner or later he would have to finish what he had started that day on the expedition. What Hell couldn't imagine yet, not even in his most ambitious plans, was that this very decision, the one to accidentally leave his most dangerous enemy alive, would be exactly what, years later, would end up leading him to his own defeat. Because before dying, Kabuto would give his grandson Koji the secret he had kept in silence for years. A robot built with a superalloy that even Hell himself didn't know about yet. A robot that, one day, would bear the name that millions of us in Mexico and all of Latin America would shout in front of the television every afternoon, Mazinger Z. And here is the irony that nobody told you about as a kid watching the cartoon.
If Hell hadn't betrayed that expedition, Mazinger Z would never have existed. The monster unintentionally created the hero.
Hatred, without intending to, ended up creating the hope of an entire generation. Go Nagai hid all of this within the pages of his original manga, published in 1972, the cartoon we watched as kids on television, dubbed in Spanish. With Baron Ashler and the decapitated Count as the weekly villains, only showed us the villain of the week, the mad scientist who sent a new mechanical beast against a giant robot in every episode. But the original manga showed us something much darker and much more human. A man whom the whole world made into a demon, long before he himself decided to fully become one of his own free will. The boy who only wanted to stop being humiliated in a schoolyard ended up becoming the villain that entire generations grew up fearing every afternoon in front of the screen. He wasn't born a monster. They built him, blow by blow, humiliation by humiliation, war by war, until one day there was no room left for anything else. Think about it for a second. That boy who dissected mice in a basement in Germany only because no one else wanted to teach him another way to feel strong. That young man who watched entire nations die in a war he hadn't started, and who only found in science a place where, finally, the world had to take him seriously. That doctor who lost the only person who treated him as an equal and decided he would never feel that kind of pain again. Every villain has an exact moment when they stop being a victim and start choosing to become an executioner themselves. That moment came among the ruins of Bardos, with the blood of his colleagues still fresh beneath his feet. And now that you know the whole story, the one the manga hid between the lines, the question is no longer as simple as it seemed at the beginning of this video. Doctors, then, Hell was the villain of this story, or was he the victim of a world that never, not even once, gave him another option? Leave it in the comments. I will find you, Kabuto.